And we heard an audible gasp on a coach of 180 teenagers that had never seen the ocean or see the ocean at the same time. So we do a week's worth of fully funded trips for students in July, which is really about cultural capital, but also about children from these more deprived families having the same level of opportunity for a bit of British culture.
Welcome to Talking Head, the podcast where school leaders share what actually works. I'm Ross, founder of Involve Education, and today I'm joined by Natasha Whiles, Executive Principal at Tove Learning Trust. Now, when Natasha arrived at Grace Academy, she quickly discovered hundreds of her students had never seen the sea. So within weeks, 600 kids were on coaches to Blackpool Beach. That immediate action, seeing what's missing and fixing it, defines her entire approach to education. But beaches were just the beginning. Natasha's real transformation came through putting literacy at the heart of everything. Today, she'll share how reading and oracy became the keys to unlocking potential across entire communities. So let's dive in. Natasha, take me back to when you first arrived at Grace Academy. What did you find?
I found a school community that had a level of deprivation that I actually hadn't seen before. And I knew deprivation and I know deprivation really well, but what I hadn't seen was kind of the impact of deprivation on education itself, on young people's ability to engage with their own education, their ambition. But actually, probably more importantly, what I saw was a community of teachers and of teaching staff and of staff beyond the classroom who desperately wanted to make a difference for young people. But at this point, we're kind of getting to that point of being a bit out of ideas of what it was that was going to make a big impact on these young people in order to really push them along in their own education, but also inspire them to want to do well in their education.
Yeah. And how did this thing happen with the beach and the sea? And, talk me through your thinking.
Well, so I grew up by the beach. I grew up in Cleveland, and it's something I took for granted. And I do come from quite a deprived family myself. I come from quite a high deprivation area. But the sea was just something I knew. And then what had happened is we were talking to a group of students around some curriculum work and to describe the ocean. And a child described the ocean to me. I'm a historian, not a geographer. But a child described this ocean to me as waves going back in and out, but kind of like you would expect an escalator to move. So I was trying to explain to this child how waves move, and I realized it's not something you can describe, actually. It's something you need to see. And then what became really clear is this young person wasn't able to explain how the ocean would make you feel, or the vast open space of an ocean. And then, that progressed to being about sand in between your toes and all of those experiences that if you've seen the beach and you've been to the beach, you take for granted. And I was talking to a teacher about it, and they said, well, yeah, we live in Coventry. And as a northerner that grew up in Cleveland, it hadn't occurred to me that if you lived in the centre of the country and you did come from a deprived family, that the ocean, the beach, a day trip out to the beach was part of that deprivation. And again, because for me, I kind of come from a really similar background, that was a level of deprivation of not seeing the sea, really dependent on where you live geographically. But actually, more importantly, it meant that for a child, you wouldn't be able to access that part of maybe an English paper that asked you to describe in that way. You wouldn't be able to access part of a geography paper. So, that imagination, that ability, deprivation, poverty meant you were getting further behind your peers just because of where you live geographically. So I said it wasn't happening.
And so can you paint the picture of what that beach day was actually like?
So what we did is we took 4 year groups, just short of around 180 students per year group. So we took 4 year groups over 4 days to Blackpool Beach. So we took a year group a day. So it was a coach trip up and a coach trip back with a year group, with the staff. And what we did is we did the piers. So we did North and Central Pier. We did the arcades, because you got to experience that. We did fish and chips. But what we did is we funded things like the machines for the arcades. We funded going to get fish and chips on the beach. We explained what seagulls at a beach were like, and we got sand in between. We played football on the beach. And we just got to understand, what the promenade was like, what the ocean was like. But for me, you know, and I've done this job for 18 years now. I don't know if you know Blackpool, but when you come up to Blackpool Beach and you come up past South Shore up to the promenade, you know, you don't know the promenade's at the end of that road until you get to the end of that road. And we, you know, you heard an audible gasp on a coach of 180 teenagers that had never seen the ocean or see the ocean at the same time. And for me, you know, that was year 1. We're on year 4 now. That trip still takes place every year, but now what happens is it's just year 7s each year. So every child that has been to Grace will go on a beach trip. But we've also added in the zoo, we've added in theme parks. So we do a week's worth of fully funded trips for students in July, which is really about cultural capital, but also, you know, about children from these more deprived families, but also all children having the same level of opportunity for a bit of British culture.
Well, that sounds amazing. I want to join in some of these trips.
It is a fantastic day out. We do. I absolutely love it.
And did you, I mean, you've talked a little bit about the students' needs, but I wonder if the kind of thinking was a little bit different to the doing. Was there anything that you kind of learned about your students and about the depth of their needs through that first trip?
No, but I tell you what I did learn. I learned how much that means to the adults. And one of the things that, you know, was really clear when I first started working at...
Do you mean the parents or the staff?
Both, but actually what I was talking about was the staff, because it was all fully funded and a lot of our staff weren't local. And for Grace, you know, when I first started, recruitment and retention of teachers was a real problem. And so what I'd done in my first year is I'd recruited a load of ECTs, I'd recruited a load of people that were new into education, weren't jaded by education, and what I told them was normal, they believed was normal, you know. But what happened is the relationships that were built on those kind of trips, the understanding of our staff around the children that they've got in front of them and where these children come from, what their communities are like, what challenges they face, what barriers they face, absolutely solidified what we call the Grace Way and around culture, and actually what our job is for these young people that goes way beyond the school gates. And so the impact on those relationships was really profound. And you asked about parents, you know, being able to say to parents, this is what we're going to do for your young person. And no, we don't expect you to pay for it. We're going to go out and we're going to find that funding for it. And every child's going to get that opportunity to come. That helped those relationships as well.
And how did you find funding for that? I mean, funding's pretty tight for schools, isn't it?
Funding is really tight for schools. And one of the things that we've been really skilled at over the last few years at Grace is working with businesses through corporate responsibility and economic responsibility. So we have had fully funded trips. Coventry Building Society have been amazing. So we fully fund that Enrichment Week, and we actually fully fund most of our trips, if not all of them. And we fully fund things like Peri lessons. And the way in which we do that is we work with organisations who understand the importance of children not having that level of deprivation that then creates a barrier between those children that have and those children that have not. So the beach trips are actually funded by Coventry Building Society now, but we partnered with a number of organisations that supported us in those trips. And I would make it my ambition to go out and always make sure that we can find the funding for that. And touch wood, we're 4 years in and I've never had to ask parents to pay for those trips.
That's great. And I'm told you went from the kind of the decision that children needed to go to the beach to doing it quite quickly. How quickly was it actually?
Weeks. Probably I'd say maybe 3.
And why so fast? I mean, I feel like most heads would think, yeah, this is something we should do. We should do this. You know, let's factor this in for, you know, next term or the term after. Why within 3 weeks?
Well, why not? I think is question number one. The second one was these kids hadn't had trips. There was no school show. They hadn't had trips. COVID had taken so much away from them in general. But actually, then you add on the deprivation element. These children weren't children that lost out because of COVID. These children lost out more because of COVID. And
yeah,
there's a lady that works for me called Emily who is just phenomenal. And at the time, she was the person that if I said, right, let's do something, we would do it together. And I said, we're going to take the whole school to the beach. And she was kind of like, what? We can't. And I said, watch me. We are. And we planned it together and we did it together. You know, and it's complicated and it's challenging, but it's not doable. And I suppose it depends what you prioritize. It's not about prioritizing a jolly off to the beach. It's about prioritizing what you know is going to make the most impact for your young people. And for us, that impact was about getting our young people to realize that we really truly believed that their character and their growth and when we made promises. I stood there on my first day and I asked them what they needed from me. I asked them at my interview, and trips was part of that. It always is. That's what children always say. But when you're looking at 600-700 children that haven't had a trip in 4 years, we have an obligation to do something about that. I believe anyway. And so yes, it was about 3 weeks. I started my headship on the 2nd of June, and we went to the beach in the first week of July. So yeah, quite.
I think it sounds great.
It wasn't the only place we did that week as well. We actually did the beach and a zoo, I believe, that year. So it wasn't the only trip we planned that week. We planned a whole week of enrichment.
Yeah.
We closed some gaps in that week. Emily was my hero during that period, and I'd like to hope, inspired her to kind of go, we can, let's.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're starting to get a bit of a sense of your kind of philosophy or leadership philosophy just from the kind of action. And I'm kind of wondering, where does that come from?
It comes from a sense of wanting to make the difference, and I used to say this statement and then say, I don't want to sound corny, and actually I don't say it anymore. I believe I have an opportunity to change the world for young people. I believe I have an opportunity to change a child's day, a child's outcome, a child's whole life, and the family around them as well. I truly believe in education we have that. And I used to use the term responsibility. I don't anymore. I use the term opportunity. For me, it comes from a point from the home life that I had myself, which wasn't a bad home life, but, it came from one with significant poverty and people that made a difference. But actually, having to have a full-time job when I was at university whilst balancing my studies, having to have a full-time job so I could do my A-levels because I couldn't afford not to, it makes you really aware of the impact of finances on your education. It drove me and it made me want to make a difference, and it made me really hardworking, and probably took, my dad would probably say it made me not want to take no for an answer sometimes and ask why a lot more. But it comes back to my moral compass tells me I can make a difference. And so if I see something that I can make a difference to, anybody that's ever worked with me or worked for me or around me would say, that's where I come from. Can we make a difference? Is this going to change something for a child in some way? Then we're going to do it, and we're going to find a way to do it. And there's probably 1,000 examples I could give you of that. But it all comes down to the same thing, is this going to make a difference for this child? And not just for their education, but for them. Then I'm going to do it. I'm going to find a way to do it.
Great. I like hearing you talk about working through your education as well. Now, I didn't have a deprived childhood. I was very fortunate in my very stable middle-class family. But, for whatever reason, I certainly used to think that all my friends got more pocket money than I did. I mean, originally I didn't get pocket money at all until I negotiated pocket money with my parents. But what I found, I find sort of increasingly I'm grateful for is that actually in different ways, I started working early as well. So from about the age of 14, I started teaching drums. I had drum pupils, so I was quite good at drums. That seemed like a good way to earn a bit of money. The parents of the students I was teaching, it was an incredible bargain for them having these lessons with a 14-year-old, the most dedicated teacher that you could have, who only had like 2 students and invested everything in them. And then when I was in sixth form, I remember going straight to the head of sixth form and saying, can I run the vending machine, and can you pay me to run the vending machine in the sixth form block? And he said yes, and I got paid £2.50 a day. Even at that age, I was ordering the stock and taking delivery whilst I was at school. Coming out of classes to do that and phoning up the suppliers. And stocking the machine. It's incredible. I almost find it incredible that actually people miss out on starting to learn about work and actually about getting money for work. I mean, I know that sounds very mercenary, but like the relationship between if I do this work, then I get to go to, Nando's with my friends on Friday. Yeah. Is that something that you can kind of relate to?
To it in some ways. And I think just going back to my own experience of it, I don't see it. I find it really difficult sometimes to use the term deprived, because I don't think I had a deprived childhood. I think I had a challenging childhood. And, you know, you used your money to go to Nando's. I used mine for school uniform. You know, I don't mean that in a flippant way at all, but I was buying my school uniform. I'm one of 6 siblings. You know, my mum was a waitress, my dad was a taxi driver. And they worked really hard, but you know, we didn't, I don't think I ate out at a restaurant until I was probably at university. You know, I just didn't have that experience of it. And those experiences have had a really long-term impact for me, because even now, you know, in some restaurants, I feel like a bit of an imposter. I feel like a bit of a fraud because I don't understand certain social norms. You know, it was only 2 years ago I knew what a wine flight was. I'm 40 years old and I'd never heard of a wine flight because that's just not the environment I grew up around. But I don't think it's deprived.
I feel like I need to ask the question. What is a wine flight, and should I know this?
Okay, well, good. It's wine that's served specifically with different courses of a meal. But again, I didn't know that there was anything other than a 3-course meal. And you know, as a child, I certainly didn't have a 3-course meal. But I don't see it as deprived. And in the same way, I actually don't use the term resilience. I really dislike when we talk about resilient children and making children resilient, because I don't think we should make our children, you know, it shouldn't be like, well, we're making our children more resilient. We should understand that children shouldn't have to be so resilient. Like, why are we not looking at making the world a better place, that they don't have to be this resilient? But just coming back to your point about kind of what I relate to, I do relate to it. But, you know, I became an assistant head teacher in my 20s. I became a head teacher of a school that, you know, people said they couldn't turn around and that was unturnaroundable at 36. You know, I became an executive head teacher at 39. My childhood didn't make me deprived. It made me driven. It made me ambitious. It made me, you know, it made me, in some respects, a little bit flippant around certain things, because if I didn't like a job, or I was, you know, I felt like I was treated in a way that I didn't think was morally okay, then I'd be like, well, I'll find another job, because I can find another job. You know, I have the ability to find another job. And I say it now, like I'd go into waitressing tomorrow if I needed to. If I lost my job tomorrow, which fingers crossed I loved waitressing. I made a great waitress, and I'll go out and do it again. So I don't have those I don't have those financial worries of, well, how would I pay my mortgage? I know truly that I'd find a way. And that's what kind of it built for me working, the social skills that it built for me, the ability to, you know, live in those environments around adults at a really young age. You know, I worked in a butcher's. I'm a vegetarian. I was a vegetarian 14-year-old working in a butcher's. I've worked in restaurants. I've worked in bars, you know. But actually, it's made me really kind of aware of social situations that are different social situations, but it hasn't made me deprived. In some respects, it's kind of one of my superpowers. And for our young people, what they're learning, the skills that they're learning are different, you know, than maybe the ones that my own children are learning, because they don't have jobs. They aren't having to work for it.
I'm really enjoying sort of diving into your successes, and they are many and varied, but I'm also conscious that part of your leadership philosophy is quite linked to the idea of really being quite comfortable with failure. And you have a funny failure story, don't you? And I'm intrigued to have you share that.
Well, I've got loads of failure stories, you know, but most of them aren't funny, if I'm honest. My attitude to my successes has always been, I have to be 10 steps ahead and look at what the worst case scenario could be, and can I fix the worst case scenario? And if I can fix the worst case scenario, I can fix anything else on the way. You know, sometimes I'm a bit of a doomsday planner. You know, I will think about what the worst thing can go wrong is. But when I started at Grace, and it's a really silly, trivial story, but it kind of sums things up for me sometimes. When I started at Grace, I'd worked at a school where children wore a coloured label on their blazer, and this coloured label allowed us to identify their year group. So when I came to Grace, I really missed that. I really missed not knowing if a year 11 was walking past me or a year 7. And I'm only 5'1", so everybody's taller than me anyway. So I don't know which kind of year group they're linked to. So when I started at Grace, I wanted this. And the school that I'd worked at was quite different demographically, so their parents would have sewed on these what they were called flashes. And my senior team felt that us sending these flashes home to parents, you know, because the head wanted something done a certain way, could rub people up the wrong way. You know, because it also, you know, this head teacher's coming in and she wants this doing, she wants that doing. And that's not actually how I am. Well, it is, but probably not with parents. You know, things I like.
It is, but hidden.
Yeah,
we
I like
hide
things
these
to be done
things
a
better,
certain
don't we?
way, but I'm happy to do them myself. So I wanted
Yeah.
I wanted a way of identifying young people, and these flashes, as they were called, were sew on. Well, I can't sew, and I am very much if I have to be able to do it myself. So I had this harebrained
Yeah.
scheme that I would change what I knew had worked previously at a previous school, and I would buy badges, a little
Yeah.
circular, if you imagine kind of the size of a £2 coin, coloured badges,
Yeah.
and the colours would be red, orange, green, yellow, and blue for the 5-year groups. And each child would get a badge and it would represent their year group. The senior team thought I was nuts. And I was like, this is, honestly, this will change your life. This will change everybody's life. Well, I hadn't necessarily doomsday planned this, and I hadn't considered that these were teenagers. So what actually happened is the badges came off and on. So the teenagers could walk past each other in the corridor and just poke each other with these badges, which was actually sharp. But not only that, they could swap them, and they could also collect them. So you'd have like a little year 7 walking around with no badges, and then like a year 10 boy walking around with a traffic light system
A full set,
on this side and more badges on this side. Or they were hiding them from each other or stealing them off each other's blazers and putting them in different places. And this just became this like trauma, because it was one of those situations where I had been stood alone saying, let's do this thing. It'll work, I promise. The senior team, well, I'm not convinced. Not for any of those reasons, by the way. So if they say I told you so, that's not. They didn't tell me those reasons. But the carnage that ensued over the next 3 days, and it was carnage because kids were stabbing each other with pins. I'd effectively given them drawing pins. And when you're bored in a maths lesson, what are you going to do to your friend? You're going to stab them with a drawing pin. So then it was kind of like, well, what do you do? Does this become a behaviour issue? You know, if children keep doing this, they're going to get a detention. Does this become me saying to teachers, this is your fault because you haven't policed this properly? Or is this me going, guys, hands up, I failed. This was a terrible plan. Let's abort.
So
and so that's, and I have the badge, by the way. I keep a badge on my desk to remind me of that.
how do you handle something like that? I mean, you're still relatively new at this stage, aren't you? So how do you handle something that you've stood up and you've said, this is the right decision. It's going to work. It's going to be great. And then it clearly hasn't gone to plan. How do you handle that?
Well, I mean, it was chaos. It was chaos, but it was comical, but also someone could have got hurt, you know? So how do I deal with something like that? The same way I always do, with complete transparency. You know, I had to go, this didn't work. I had to stand in front of staff and say, wow, guys, you know, I'm really sorry. I had to apologise and say, this is completely on me. This is a terrible idea. And that's what I've done in stories where I've failed, and it hasn't been something trivial, actually. And there's been times where I've had to say to people, bear with me. I promise you, bear with me. It'll be worth it in the end. So there's been other times where I've had to stand in front of a staff body and say, this might not seem like it's working, or this might seem like it's a real challenge, but I need you to trust me. And the reason they trust me, and you know, whether that's a harebrained, let's go to the beach, let's change a whole process, let's put different systems in place. The reason for that, I believe, and I think they would say the same, is I lead with my heart. So, you know, I've often stood there and gone, wow, this isn't going to plan, or this is going to plan. It just doesn't look like it right now because we're in the trenches, and I need you to trust me that I can see the sunlight, and I need you to move forwards with me. So, you know, touch wood, I haven't yet had a staff body say, no, we're not gonna go that way. I haven't met that kind of resistance, and I believe I haven't met that kind of resistance because I'm transparent, and it does come from the heart. And when I make a mistake, I am the first person to say, yeah, my bad, let's fix this. But here's how we're going to fix it, and here's how I'm going to help you fix it. And just so you know, every child at Grace has a flash sewn onto their badge, onto their blazer now, but we sew them on. So we spend 3 days at the start of each year sewing them on. And I still haven't learned to sew, but I keep that badge on my desk.
How have you managed to have these badges sewn on and yet avoid to learn how to do it?
That's really good leadership, isn't it? Knowing where your
delegation.
Well, no, it's actually knowing where your failure is, because there was an occasion when I was 14 where I sewed my blazer to my skirt in a textiles class, and a teacher told me I should stay away from a sewing machine, and I have taken that piece of advice, and I've never been near a sewing machine since.
That sounds very convenient, Natasha. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I feel like so often the expectation and the kind of demand is like a good leader is one who doesn't change their mind, or who doesn't kind of, you will see something through no matter what. And this always slightly baffles me, and it's kind of why it's so warming, really, to hear some of your story, because the point you're making is actually a better leadership. A better leader is a leader who is actually going to be quick to address things and to tackle things if it wasn't the right decision. That's the kind of leader I'd be much more up for trusting, who says, we're going to go in this direction. And that either it's going to be amazing, or if it was the wrong decision, it's going to be tackled soon. We're not going to be kind of forced to grind this out. Yeah. So it's great to hear. And well done. With your ownership of failure as actually not something that's this terrible thing to be avoided, I wonder, is that, what's that teaching you about leadership?
I think that, for me, it depends on what you classify as failure. Have I failed a child today? Because if I failed a child today, I'm in the wrong job. Have I failed an adult today? Have I failed myself today? Have I failed my family today? Failure is such a big word. I think it's about recognizing where your hard lines are on failure. There's processes and policies and strategies and things that you can put into place that might be reactive that are going to fail at times because you haven't necessarily had the opportunity to plan it out properly or to really think about what the long-term implications of that are. For me, the decisions I make as a leader come from the same place every time. And therefore, if something goes wrong because it's come from that same place, then it's okay that it went wrong because the place remains the same.
Going back to your approach to literacy in school, when did you kind of know this approach was working? Or what did you see? What did you hear that made you think, yes, this is making a difference?
So I actually started that approach during COVID at a different school. One of the things that I did myself during COVID was kind of, because we felt so kind of useless, especially in education. We weren't really sure what we could do, and that, there were children that were out in their homes and we didn't have access to them, and particularly in those really early days of COVID, it was a scary time. And so the book of their own kind of projects, as I'd call it now, started then during that kind of lockdown idea and getting books to kids. How did I know it was making an impact then? Well, I didn't, because I didn't get to see it, but I got to see it when they came back and they talked about having books and what they were reading and what they'd read during lockdown. Because again, being really savvy and being really aware of what children could end up on if they were spending all that time online and getting more and more isolated. So there was that. How I saw an impact at Grace and how we see an impact at Grace is the organic nature of those bookshelves. I don't really have to do anything with them anymore. Children go and get books from them and they encourage one another. So at lunch, you will see somebody reading, they'll have picked up a new book and they'll be reading by the bookshelves, and they'll be hiding because they're not technically supposed to be there over lunch, because it's a nice, warm, snug place. It's supposed to be somewhere that it's not actually a reading space. It's the space where the books are. But you'll see them there, and you'll see children come down during the course of the day to get books. But actually, what we see is the organic nature of it. They are often refilled by staff, and I don't sort of talk about why that is anymore. I don't necessarily need to. Children encourage one another, and you'll see members of staff walk by and they'll tidy it up a bit, or they'll look for a different book, or you'll see staff bringing books in. So where did we see the impact? Well, it's the organic impact, but also children will come to me and again, I'll say like, oh miss, have you seen that there's these books out? Can we get some for the bookshelves? So they don't necessarily ask about the library because they have an opportunity to do that in their library lessons. But they will come and find me to tell me about the bookshelves and to ask for books on the bookshelves. But actually, more importantly, they'll go to any adult and ask that. They don't need it to be me anymore, which for someone like me is quite sad because, I'm not needed anymore. But actually, it's exactly what it should be. It should be organic. It should be self-sustaining.
Are there literacy programs or strategies that go beyond the bookshelf? Don't get me wrong, the bookshelf sounds great, but...
Yeah, you can't... Yeah, it's great, but if you can't access it, what's the point? Yes, absolutely. So, I started earlier to say kind of this whole literacy project was kind of had 4 or 5 arms to it, really. The first one being the books, because you needed children to want to read. You needed them to want to take that book home that other children are reading. The second one was the library. So, and I often describe it in this way, and I feel really bad if I ever find the person who designed it that way, because I'm probably going to have a lot to answer for. But our library was where books went to die at Grace. And the library was shut during COVID, which, went against everything that I believed educationally. So when I came to Grace, and the library was a place, in my opinion, that books went to die, and it was closed off, and it was dark, and it was dreary. Even the windows were closed off. I kind of was like, no, we're going to rip it out. And we did. We ripped out the entire library and we moved it to a different space in the school that's beautiful and it's airy. And you can see it all over the school's Facebook and our Twitter, because it was a massive project that we did. But it's big open windows and it's light and it's airy. And our books up there they're through the programme of Accelerated Reader. They are diverse. They are from a huge diversity of authors. But we asked children what they wanted. We did a big project on what children wanted in that library. And then I went out, and Fiera Real Estate raised just shy of £60,000 for us as part of one of our partnerships. So Project Grace, as we called it at the time, was about really redoing that whole library, and we did it, and it is stunning. And 4 years down the line, it still looks the way it looked.
And you talk about oracy being important. Now, obviously, I think we can all kind of attest to the fact that you're a pretty good speaker. I'm feeling quite enthusiastic about this the visit that we've now mentioned that's going to happen with me coming to Grace and bringing some books. I guess I want to dig more into that. What does great oracy education look like? I mean, oracy isn't... Look, I go to more teacher conferences than you'd care to imagine in order to be telling teachers about Involve Education. Oracy it's not really a buzzword of those conferences. It doesn't sound... If it's fashionable, it's not one of the kind of teaching fashion trends that I've picked up on.
It's not fashionable, is it? That's the point. Like, oracy kind of sounds like a tick box exercise. You just said, that I'm well spoken. Well, thank you. I'm well spoken for a northerner that had to learn to read out loud when I was stood in front of a class and realised at 21 years old, I'd never read out loud. I'm somebody who went into education and didn't want to ask what the word pedagogy meant for a year.
I think we've all been there. I'd just like to make it clear, as teachers, we have all been there when people have been banding around pedagogy, and then and you think everyone else seems to know what this word means. But carry on.
Yeah, we're all faking it. But the point is, it's so, you saying to me then, you're well spoken, hit me in a place that I've never heard before. Because I'm northern. So when I first moved down south and I started teaching in just outside of Milton Keynes, it was really identifiable that I was northern. And I worked at really hiding that, which is hilarious because you can't hide it if you tried. But I thought if I didn't sound quite so northern, maybe I'd sound more intelligent. And actually, oracy is about knowledge.
Wait a minute.
Oracy is about
knowledge. What does that mean?
It's about knowing what language you're using and why you're using it in the way that you're using. And I am not using fancy words to get you to listen to what, I'm not even saying the word to. I just heard myself say to. I'm it's not about being elocutionally well-spoken for me. Oracy is about an understanding of the language that you are using and the purpose of that language that you are using, and being confident in doing that. And for me, and the story, the analogy I would use is about deprivation again. We're teaching children from deprived backgrounds the word bird. They know what a bird is, but a child that's middle class will have had an experience of an egret or of a crow, or they might have had an experience of a difference between a parrot and a budgie. And a child that is in a different class, in this situation where I'm being recorded, I don't want to reel off those words, because what if I get them wrong? Actually, what we should be doing is closing that oracy gap. Children from families in deprived communities do have a huge oracy gap and a huge linguistic gap in their knowledge of birds, birds being the example that I'm using. So we need to be talking to children not about birds. We need to be saying, this magpie, this crow, look at the colours on this particular kingfisher, and it's how we use language in that way in the classroom that really helps close that oracy gap.
So how do you teach oracy?
And how we practice that explicitly? Well, first of all, you role model it. And that's been a real fun for me with teachers at Grace when I first started at Grace. You know, they talked about Cov. What's Cov? Coventry. You mean that city that you live in? Okay, so let's talk about Coventry. And we had this fun, and it was funny, around sandwiches and batches, and how a batch is a sandwich. And I'm like, a batch isn't a sandwich. A batch can't be a sandwich because a batch is more than one of something. And having this really hilarious debate around what a batch meant. What it is it's about being in a classroom and having that relationship with a child to be able to correct them when they use the term call. It's about being able to say to them, what kind of bird? And what do you notice about that bird? And describe that bird a little bit more. You're talking about a bluebird. What bird could that be? When we're looking in books, when we're doing class readers together, actually not just assuming that a child understands what's being said in that. So that comprehension element of reading, how do we dig into that? And that is explicitly taught. It's explicitly taught in English. But it's also explicitly taught in those subjects that are literacy and oracy heavy, your histories, your geographies, science. It's teaching explicit terminology to children. So they're not goggles, they're safety glasses. It's not a glass tube, it's a test tube, you know, and it's about having really high expectations around language all of the time, in the corridor, everywhere. But we teach oracy when we teach relationships. We teach oracy when we talk about conversational oracy. So actually it's about being really, really explicit with our language, but also accepting that just because I'm Northern doesn't mean I'm not well spoken, but actually being able to say that to children. And I use terms like, and, you know, and these are character elements of my language and my oracy. And I'm okay with that and how we celebrate that.
I think anyway. And has this had, like, have you seen an impact? Are there any specific sort of student transformations that you've been able to kind of witness as a result of teaching oracy?
We see student transformations in conversation, you know, and a really fantastic example of it would probably be through a program that we're part of, which is Career Ready, where we send all of our sixth formers through different organisations. All of our sixth formers are mentored by business people, and quite senior business people, and they're all mentored, and they have weekly meetings with these business men, women, and they go and do a bit of work experience with them, and they really engage in their organizations. And if we'd have talked 4 years ago, you know, I would have had to say to you, we had to spend a lot of time talking to those young people about that, how to deal within those language elements and how to deal in that relationship. And the feedback that I would always get from businesses was, they're very polite. Grace kids are so polite. They're so well-mannered. They're taught such great manners. And I really do believe that really is a community thing, that we teach them explicit manners, but it comes from the community. But they're so well-mannered, but it would be really clear that they come from really quite deprived backgrounds. Whereas now that oracy gap has been closed. So when our children go off to Warwick University, when our children go off into the workplace, when they go to Russell Group universities, they are not going to feel in language situations that they are somewhat deprived. And I think, is there a transformation? Yes.
Do you have
and we see it day in, day out.
Story of a specific child that you can tell us about who's been able to kind of go on that journey?
Yeah, one of the ones that I talked to you about is, so we had a year 7 child who had come up from primary school, been with us for a year, and actually this was at the start of year 8. So they'd been with us for about 14 months. And their behaviour was really disruptive. This child would probably be somebody that by this point in their education would be looking at a permanent exclusion from education because of their behaviour was so disruptive. And their behaviour being disruptive was disruptive in the classroom. It was also disruptive in the corridor. So it was actually quite hard to unpick. No specific learning needs had ever been identified. So this child, last stop hotel kind of thing is to me. So, you know, they've been suspended, they've been in isolation, they've gone through all of the behaviour issues, and now they're sat in my office. And normally when this happens, we have a good chat about what's going on with their behaviour, and then I chuck a book at them. And it's quite often the fox, the mole and the horse, but I chuck a book at them and I say, look, just read. I've got things I need to be doing. And normally that's so that they're quiet and that they've got time to regulate themselves, because a child can pretend to be reading, but actually just know that if they're quiet, that if they know that they're quiet, then they're not going to get into trouble. So this particular boy was sat with this book, and I don't know what happened, but I said, look, why don't you read a little bit to me? actually I could do with a bit of break from what I'm doing. Why don't we do a bit of reading? And he said, I can't. I said, what do you mean you can't? And I was really quite shocked by it because I'd been at Grace for a year. I was really quite shocked by it. I said, what do you mean? And this was a really quite simple book, probably chronological reading age of about an 8-year-old. And he said, I can't read it. And so I sat with him and got him to read to me. And at the time, my youngest was 4, so was in reception. And my youngest child was blending better than this 13, 14-year-old that was sat in front of me. And I had 2 concurrent thoughts. One, oh my God, how and who am I going to get mad at? Because what on earth has their English teacher been doing for the last 15 months? What has their history teacher been doing? What has their science teacher been doing? How has nobody recognised that this child can't read? And the second one was, oh my God, we're going to be in so much trouble with this parent when we tell them. And it was, it was kind of like, I'm going to phone this parent up and say, your child can't read. And we should have identified this 14 months before, when this child came to secondary school. So why didn't we? So my brain's gone into, as I said to you earlier, worst case scenario, like, how do I make sure that we fix this problem? But also, how do I make sure it doesn't happen again? So I called the parent myself. I called the dad, and the dad came in, and the dad arrived, and the dad came in and it smelled really strongly of fuel, like petrol. And he was wearing a high-vis jacket, and dad sat down with the young man. And I, being very transparent, very honest, started with I'm really sorry. We take full responsibility here. I don't know how this has happened. This would explain so much of their behaviour issues, but your son can't read, and I'm sorry. And I expected the dad to lose his head. What do you mean my child can't read? Or be defensive. Of course he can read. You're being ridiculous. It's not a special need, because we often get that. And he looked at his son, and his son was sat there, and he looked at his son and he said, oh, don't worry about it, son. I've done all right for myself. You don't need to be able to read. And at that moment, I was heartbroken, because I realised so many things I hadn't realised till that moment. And that was, one, this dad believed that he was fine. He'd gone through life not being able to read, and he'd done all right for himself. And that was his ambition for his son. His dad worked on the tip. And he was saying to his son, I've done all right for myself. You can not read, and you can be just like me. And it's like, how do you say to a child, that's not ambitious. That's not an ambitious goal for you. This young man is a really, really charming young man, really intelligent young man. And dad's lovely. But dad just had no concept that this wasn't doing all right for himself. And actually, why were we telling a 13-year-old boy that it was okay to just never have learned to read? But also, that also meant the parents knew that the child couldn't read. And then you're in a whole different problem. What do you do? How do I fix this problem without undermining the parent, without making the parent feel inept or useless? How do I tell the child that he has to learn to read, and that actually that isn't ambitious, that's basic? And how do I fix this problem? And we took the child off timetable for 6 weeks with parents' permission to teach him to read. And it's where we discovered Fresh Start. It's where we really got under the kind of the mechanics of Lexia, because a lot of these phonics programs are primary led. So a lot of our secondary professionals, these are not, especially not 4 years ago, these are not programs that we're used to. We are now, but we weren't then. But also, how are you going to teach a child to read that? I'm guessing the primary school, in my naivety, I'm thinking I can save the world. This primary school has obviously failed him. Well, the primary school mustn't have failed him. What happened? And these behaviour issues were covering all of this up. But actually, you asked me for a story. This young man is coming to the end of his education journey. He can read. His chronological reading age is closed. He is now chronologically at reading age. He's not been suspended once since.
That's a wonderful story.
And I said to him, I saw him in the corridor a few weeks ago, and I said to him, gosh, I've not seen you in ages. I forgot you were still here. Become one of those children whose name you don't hear every day. And the reason is because he can read. And yet we had to be really careful that relationship with that family is so important to us. And also how he looks up to his dad. That's a huge role model for him. We've got to be careful with that. So, would dad be annoyed by me telling this story? I really hope not. But that's the story that I would say showed me some naiveties, but showed us that we can change the world.
Your successes at Grace do just sound phenomenal. That's it from Natasha from Tove Learning Trust, proving that transformation starts with seeing what others miss and having the courage to act immediately, not in a year's time, but immediately. So if today's conversation about literacy, leadership, and the power of the sea inspired you, I'd love to hear about it. And you can find more episodes wherever you get your podcasts. If you know a school leader who sees gaps and fills them, send them our way. Until next time, lead well.